I'm Kathy Fennessy, and I'm a music and film writer, and I used to be the music director at KCMU between 1988 and 1991. My first knowledge of Soundgarden was through the Rocket, because I would see this ad in the Rocket from time to time, and it was a picture of Chris Cornell without a shirt. It was the cover of Screaming Life, which was their first EP, and I thought, well, that looks interesting. But it also looked kind of metal, which kind of bunked the trend of what was going on in Seattle at the time. Didn't actually see them as a live band until they were playing bigger venues, so I would end up seeing them at the Paramount. And I remember seeing them at Bumbershoot with a big crowd, and that was exciting because by then they had signed to a major label. A lot of people knew the band, they knew the songs, there were a lot of people singing along, so it was a whole totally non-club scene. Whereas Mudhoney, the first thing I heard, and again, I think I'd heard of them before I actually heard the music, but I was aware of Green River, so I knew who Mark Arm was. I knew he'd been in a band before, and I had heard Green River and liked Green River. And then Mudhoney put out a single. So they formed, they put out a single, Touch Me, I'm Sick. When it came out, it was such a big deal. It wasn't just big in Seattle, but all of a sudden everybody in England was talking about it. And I think that was kind of a game changer for Seattle. And AIDS was a big deal at the time, so some people wondered, is this a song about AIDS? And by that I mean Touch Me, I'm Sick. What exactly are they talking about? So it also got a debate going as to what the song was about and how it could be interpreted. And just musically, it just grabbed you because it didn't sound like anything else. It didn't sound like Soundgarden. Didn't sound like any of the more psychedelic pop groups at the time, like Pure Joy or Room 9. Kind of had a punk attitude in terms of these vocals that just came right at you, and you were forced to engage. Either you liked it or you didn't like it, but one way or the other you were going to have a reaction. And so that was maybe the most significant single to come out of Seattle, Touch Me, I'm Sick, even more than Nirvana, whose first single was great, but it wasn't something that really attacked you in the same way. So unlike Soundgarden and unlike Mudhoney, Nirvana wasn't a group I knew about beforehand, and I think that's partly because they started in Aberdeen and they had roots in Olympia as well. They're just not a band I'd heard about, no, but I do remember one day getting the single Love Buzz, which I thought was great, and everybody else seemed to, although it didn't grab me as much as Mudhoney or Soundgarden. I remember thinking it was really good, but it wasn't necessarily as distinctive as those groups. But I would feel differently once I actually heard more from the band. The buzz on them, from my perspective, didn't build as quickly as it did on Mudhoney or Soundgarden. With Nirvana, I thought it was a totally different situation. The single was good, I bought the single, Bleach came out, and that's kind of when the hype started to grow. And I did see them live around that time at the Vogue, opening for the Flaming Lips, and I thought they were great when they played, but they didn't really know how to put on a show. They would play a song and then they'd fiddle around with trying to get the tuning just right, and that made the crowd a little bit listless. I remember talking to Wayne Coyne of the Flaming Lips afterwards, and he'd already heard the buzz about the band, and he didn't say he didn't like them, but he kind of looked at me and said, I don't really quite see what the big fuss is. So at that point, they were liked, but I don't think anybody was ecstatic. By the time they came out with Nevermind, which had a much more polished sound. They also were better at actually putting on a show, and their record release party was kind of before they were putting on these big shows in big venues, and it was at the Rebar, which is a fairly small bar in Seattle. So I met Kurt, said hi, that was about it. He didn't seem to be in a very talkative mood. He didn't seem grumpy, but he didn't seem thrilled either. He kind of seemed like, I'm here because I'm supposed to be here. And at a certain point, the band were just kind of playfully throwing some food at each other. And it was kind of immature, but it wasn't a terrible thing. Nobody was looking at them like, wow, these guys are really awful. Aren't they terrible rock star people? But the managers of the Rebar, however, were not happy and kicked them out. But we found Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic in the parking lot. So we talked to Chris for a little bit. I don't think I talked to Dave, who at the time was new to Seattle and also fairly new to the band because he was replacing Chad Channing. I don't know where Kurt was. I think he'd already left by that point, but basically the rumors about them getting kicked out of their own record release party are true. But I don't recall that they did anything more obnoxious than that. I don't think they were fighting or yelling at each other, just a little food throwing. I think when grunge started, it was seen as a masculine phenomenon. A lot of these bands were male, had male frontmen, but I do think women were interested in the music and would go to the shows and buy the record. Groups with female members did form, and women did join bands. There was a group, Calamity Jane. There's a group called Dickless, who put out a single on Sub Pop and might have had more of a following if they had stayed together longer, but they didn't, and that was kind of a problem with some of these bands for various reasons. In the case of Dickless, I think the people who bought that single really appreciated the fact that the lead singer could scream as loud as any of the guys in town. She was just this petite redhead, but she went for it. But I think in Seattle there were more women who were involved behind the scenes, and some of them are pretty well known, like Susie Tennant, who worked for DGC and still lives and works in the Seattle area. She was representing groups like Nirvana and also the Posies, who were on DGC at the time. There was for a while Donna Dresch from Team Dresch, who played bass in the Screaming Trees. Also Megan Jasper, who works at Sub Pop. So there were a variety of women who worked at different labels, but I think in retrospect it will still probably always be seen more as a sort of masculine phenomenon, even though women were involved in a lot of different ways, just not as many front women. So to their credit, Sub Pop managed to survive the whole grunge boom, because whenever there's a boom, there's kind of a bust, and I know that times were hard for them, but in diversifying, not every band that they signed hit, but a lot did, and some really spectacularly, like the Postal Service. Even though they only put out one record, it's one of the best sellers on Sub Pop, and the Shins and groups like that. So Sub Pop's been able to keep going, and one of the ways in which they've diversified is in signing hip-hop groups, and I think that's a scene right now that even though it's always existed, I think this might actually be one of the best times for hip-hop in Seattle, because when the whole grunge thing was happening, there was Sir Mix-a-Lot, Kid Sensation. There was a very popular hip-hop show on KCMU called Rap Attack, which still exists. It has a different name, and it's hosted by Larry Mizell Jr., who also writes for The Stranger, and has been involved in different groups, and has been involved in promotion and things like that. He's a very big fan, as am I, of Shabazz Palaces, who are now on Sub Pop. So that's something new for Sub Pop to sign a hip-hop group, although they're not just any hip-hop group, because they are also a band that has long-time ties to Seattle. The front man, even though he was in Diggable Planets for a while, which was a New York-based group, his roots are in Seattle. And Sub Pop's also signed THEESatisfaction, which is a female group, 2 women who appear on the Shabazz Palaces record. They're also openly gay, and they're an integral part of the scene. So that's also, I think, something that speaks well of Seattle, that whether a hip-hop group is male, female, gay, straight, there's a lot of acceptance. And another group worth keeping an eye on is Champagne, very good live act with a charismatic frontman, Pearl Nelson, who's also part of this scene. There are plenty of bands that are good, but I think that's the most exciting area right now.
Automatically couldn't be determined. First version, phone and virgins, my words perfect, like I'm smoking on some.